I will pass to our first speaker, Decca from Adesso, yes, who is going to be starting us off on the cash and practice panel, cash, gender and practice panel. Please.
Hi everyone. I hope you bear with me. I've got a bit of a cold. So I'm the Cash and Social Protection Advisor at Adesso. I wanted to touch on our work that we've been doing in Somalia, specifically in South Somalia. So Tenzin had mentioned some research that she had done with us, WRC had done with Adesso, on looking at how cash and GBV are integrated within a humanitarian response. So following that pilot research, we had incorporated a few questions in our PDM tool, PDM post-distribution monitoring tool. And looking at that, we wanted to see how we could hone in on further gender analysis and a more gender-focused lens on our work in Somalia as Adesso, where we have done gender programming before, but we didn't have a gender strategy per se. So when I think this has been touched on in the panel and in some of Karen's remarks, and I think you are very familiar with it. Gender is kind of used as a separate component. It's not integrated in any of these types of programming. And cash is a tool, right? It's not a sector. So you'll get, even in some circles, even within our own agencies, you'll get people rolling their eyes when you hear about gender. At community level also, when you hear gender, they think it's something related only for women. There's a threat of changing roles in society, things like that. So, yeah, I'm getting to see that gender is not an extra or additional component, extra additional work for those who work in the humanitarian sector or development. Trying to get them to see that it is a basic principle, like the other principles that we adhere to. So for Adesso, what have we been trying to do to resolve this issue so that we're not working as two separate teams of gender and cash? So looking at incorporating gender considerations within the project cycle management, looking at gender at proposal stage, as was mentioned, there's not that much work put into gender assessments or gender analysis. And then at implementation level, working with the communities at the grassroots level, including in decision-making structures, accountability and feedback, and community mobilization itself, and then the monitoring of it and the evaluation of how you are incorporating those gender considerations. So using the pilot research, we were able to use that tool and incorporate it in all our monitoring of OIC, cash transfer programming. Also looking deeper at our accountability and feedback mechanisms, making a more concerted effort to open up different channels so that both men and women feel comfortable enough to report back on any issues that they're facing. Some of the questions that we incorporated were to do with safety and security, control, deeper questions on control of cash when received and how it's spent, etc. We're happy to say, though it's not like we're giving ourselves a pat on the back, this person should have been on our team, as you get the food security and livelihoods person, you have the wash person, you should also have the gender person. So we recently recruited a gender and conflict management coordinator. We felt that you need someone dedicated to looking. You need to. Sorry, people in the back. You need someone dedicated to looking at those gender considerations and outcomes in relation to cash transfer programming and any other type of programming that you implement. Some of the challenges have been knowledge gaps for some of our staff. Though when we were doing the pilot research, we had trained some of our staff on what is gender and in relation to CTP. In our sector we have a lot of turnover, and also trying to keep that momentum so that it's constantly in the back of our mind that we should be looking at, using a gender lens approach. Then gender being seen as something that only concerns women. We could have also gone deeper with our gender analysis, so ensuring that whatever type of cash transfer programming that we want to implement, making sure that we have a deeper analysis of it and incorporating an aspect of the gender assessment within our initial needs assessment. And also just locating more training opportunities. So we're looking to update our gender strategy and make it something more uniform. As Karen has talked about before, there's a lot of resources available. We don't have to start from scratch. But just making sure that we're all on the same page as at Adesso, that we'll be looking at these priorities within the gender strategy. Making sure that we prioritize staff capacity also in terms of gender and cash. At Adesso, we are pioneers of cash programming in the Horn and East Africa. So we want that same kind of spirit in terms of gender. And then, of course, having better coordination between cash and gender actors, not just within our agency, but also with our other peers within the area. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Rishi, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so ActionAid. Do you want me to stand up? Okay. So ActionAid is a women's rights organisation, and we feel that women are still not front and centre when it comes to decision making around cash. We feel that any gender focus is still quite superficial, considering differences between differences in gender norms, to doing no harm, and I think that's been echoed so far. On risk, we're concerned we're still not thinking about the risk of creating shifts in gender norms that could have both positive and negative outcomes for women and girls during the cash programme, but also months and potentially years after. We believe that gender transformation is something that's not a priority or feasible in the time frame of a humanitarian response, and is often deprioritised in favour of other priorities. The majority of cash is still being delivered through the multilateral system, which often squeezes budgets and under-resources INGO and local actor budget lines on assessments and analysis and impact measurement, and we're concerned about that. And overall, there's a lack of evidence, and I think people have mentioned that already on the previous panel, that on how gender and protection analysis can be used to design better cash responses, including transformational change, women's leadership, and how that can be achieved at different points in cash responses. So ActionAid, although cash is new, and we became a member of CaLP last year, we're resourcing that. We're committed to advancing cash programme to address some of these issues. And ActionAid's humanitarian signature helps us to more broadly conceptualise how we respond to women in crisis, and how we can do cash in a more transformative way. That talks about three things. One, shifting the power. So that's about changing the humanitarian system to ensure that power is devolved to women, to local actors. We feel like there's power that's too centralised in the humanitarian system. Accountability to affected communities. Ultimately, we feel that communities should lead this process. But primarily, women's leadership in emergencies is the aspect that runs through all of our humanitarian programming. So some examples of that are, in DRC, ActionAid is engaging in a protection and cash response for conflict-affected women in Kasai province. An integral part of the response was establishing women community committees responsible for raising awareness on women's rights, law, engaging men and boys in organising community meetings, to track work plans on GBV prevention and reduction. Within this programme, women were also trained as paralegals, raising their profile in the community. As part of this whole system that was created, which was part of a humanitarian programme but intended to be a long-term system, we integrated cash programming through mobile money to meet immediate needs and support self-recovery. We did have some learning around that, and ActionAid found that this approach empowered women to engage in decision-making processes and feel valued. We know that there's been some transformational change, but it's difficult to get evidence on how lasting that change is, so that's something that we want to address in our programme moving forward. Also, CASI was a new crisis, and it presented an opportunity to compare responses done in CASI to other contexts within DRC. We feel that was unfortunately a missed opportunity to do operational research in that context. I want to talk also about another example in Somaliland, where we did quite a large response to the drought last year. And there was a conscious effort to put women front and centre in the decision making around the response. So we implemented a combination of food, wash, both in kind and cash. As part of the food response, ActionAid set up with communities emergency response committees that led the decision making around the design of the programme. So at first that included such things as selection of food suppliers, checking quality, but really leading the process. As the situation changed and we scaled up cash, they also led the design of the cash response, so that included which mechanism to choose, timing, value, etc. So this attempted to address gender equalities, as women and men were not normally involved in such a decision-making process, and it elevated women to a role of power in the community. Parallel to that, we also worked with the traditional governance mechanisms that were mainly male-dominated. And over the period of the response, we also set up women-specific groups that identified specific needs for women and girls. The two mechanisms worked well, and one key achievement was that after the drought response, in a number of committees, women were formally included in the traditional governance mechanisms. So that we saw as a significant kind of achievement in terms of transformation in those communities. I just wanted to finish, because I've gone over time, with just some key recommendations for the wider sector and for ActionAid. So as ActionAid, we're committed to raising, to contributing to grand bargain work streams for localisation and cash, and raising the importance of women's rights and gender in those. We're currently developing research and a policy strategy that will commit to research on cash and gender in the future. We're actually going through a process of updating our community-based women's protection approach and manual to integrate cash into that for cash for protection outcomes. And overall, ActionAid is committed to building the capacity of local actors and women's groups in particular to implement cash in ways that can achieve outcomes or contribute to women's empowerment more broadly. We'd like to collaborate in the future with other partners on programming and on advancing the research agenda.
Thank you, Rishi.
That's it.
Anna, over to you.
Hi, my name is Anna Lucatella. I'm the head of programs for the UN Women Jordan Country Office. And what I came here today is to share with you our experience, specifically within the context of Cash for Work programming within the two main refugee camps in Jordan, Zaatari and Azraq. So just very quickly, the relevant camp context is they were established, Zaatari first in 2012, Azraq shortly afterwards. Zaatari has 80,000 people, Azraq has over 30,000 people. And the Cash for Work programming is one of the types of cash-based assistance programs, but it's one that, when it started, was very much creating and designing opportunities that were only being accessed by men in the camps. And this was in a context where we knew that about 30% of the households in the camp were actually female-headed, and were not accessing those kinds of Cash for Work opportunities. This is relevant, of course, because they were opportunities that were very much kind of in, waste management, construction things in the camp, and not seen as appropriate for women to be doing socially, in terms of the social norms that were governing the community. So where UN Women came in was we were present in the camp from the beginning, but we had started out with a space that was like a safe space focused on SGBB response. But it quickly became clear, this was a protracted conflict, the livelihoods issue was one that was becoming relevant, and so over the years our response has been has transformed into something we call the Oasis model. So we have 3 Oasis centers in Zatari camp, we have 1 in Azraq camp, and we are in the process this year of establishing 5 outside of the camps in non-camp settings, because actually in Jordan only 20% of the Syrian refugees are in the camps. The other 80% are actually living in host communities. So there's a very big difference between the camp and the non-camp settings and the kind of response that's possible, but I'm only going to give the example right now of what we're doing in the camp setting. So the Oasis model is essentially has 3 building blocks, which is the livelihoods, the GBV response, and the women's kind of civic engagement and leadership. And the cash for work is the incentive or the entry point for getting women into the Oasis. Because in many cases, women and girls were not allowed to leave their caravans. There was a lot of fear about the safety, protection issues. So the idea that the family could get an injection of cash, or the household could get an injection of cash, was an incentive to allow the woman or the girl to leave the caravan or the home and to go into the Oasis Center. And then once she's in the Oasis Center, she has access to this whole range of services related to livelihood training, because now we can link it. The government of Jordan has allowed a work permit scheme for Syrian refugees, so we can link the cash for work and the livelihoods to work permits outside of the refugee camp. It's linked to the GBV, the referral network within the camp, with the awareness raising, knowledge about other services that are available to prevent and protect from violence, and it's linked to a whole component around civic engagement within the camp community, leadership skills, and a women's committee within the camp that engages with camp management to reflect women's needs and concerns. So the cash for work is very much kind of the incentive and the entry point into the Oasis, where then a whole other range of services are provided that allows the woman then to increase her bargaining power within the household if she is not the head of her household. And then that leads to that very slowly recognized transformation in terms of gender roles within the community and within the household, in terms of whether a woman has decision-making power over what is done with that income in the household. We do have a standard tool for a baseline and an end line. Our cash for work follows the camp SOPs on cash for work. And so there's various, let's say, scales in terms of the kind of work and the pay for that work and how long the rotation can be. This is something that's very closely monitored by the government of Jordan and UNHCR, because they want to ensure equality of opportunity among refugees in the camp, so that no refugee family, of course, starts to have a lot of money and another one doesn't. And the flow of cash is very much also regulated within the camp. I'm talking very fast, there's a lot to this, but I'd be happy to talk about it later in more detail. And that brings me then kind of to the last point that I'll touch on, which is the one related to cash delivery. Because of course, what we found very quickly in the beginning was that there was concern about the main cash distribution points, which essentially, there were a number of different humanitarian partners doing different cash for works, but it was all distributed, all the cash was distributed through a central point in the camp. And women had concerns about that point, that disbursement point, distribution point, in terms of both harassment, safety of having the cash within the household. If it wasn't a female-headed household, their husband knowing when they would get the cash, and they wouldn't necessarily have time to use it before the husband could take it. So our delivery point in the beginning for the first several years was essentially UN Women. We ourselves would distribute the cash to the beneficiaries in our Oasis Center, and we would vary the distribution time so that there wasn't a predictable time. So that if the woman wanted to take the cash and on her way home that day buy something for the children, pay back a debt, do something like this, she would be able to do that before she came to the household. And often the money at the beginning would be taken from her. But because the rotations vary from 3 to 6 to 12 months, we did find that over time the woman, through all of the services that she was accessing in the Oasis, could increase her bargaining power within the household in terms of how that cash would be used. And so we do have a lot of research in terms of looking at what is the cash used for. Most often it's return debt. After that it's fresh fruit and vegetables, because the WFP supermarkets don't have the high quality vegetables and fruits. And then after that it was cigarettes, and the men smoke, women don't smoke in the camp. And then after that also looking at usually water and ice, because electricity is an issue, so ice is used to keep food fresh. But what happened over time was we were finding this cost-effective issue in terms of UN Women distributing cash. Then we switched to partnering with UNOPS to do the cash delivery for us. So that's our current model, and it's more cost-effective, and we are able to continue doing it through the Oasis and not through the central cash distribution point of the campaign. What we're looking at right now is we've done research on the digital divide within the camp and financial inclusion issues, and we're currently partnering with WFP on their Building Blocks blockchain, which they use to distribute their food vouchers within the camps, Zaatari and Azraq refugee camps. And we've created a UN Women node on this blockchain, and now we'll be doing at least we're piloting with about half of our cash distributions through the blockchain. So the woman will be able to, in fact, not only once a month, but she'll be more flexible in terms of being able to go to the WFP supermarket and receive cash back from the cashier at varied times during the month. We can do uploads on a weekly basis to the blockchain, and then she can access it in that way. I have to stop, but just lastly on the blockchain issue, it's interesting because there is a very significant digital divide. So in terms of being able to monitor how much of her money is on the blockchain, women did describe that men in the family, there's usually one smartphone per household, and it is controlled and monopolized by the men. And they use access to the smartphone as a bargaining chip within the household. So if you do this, then I'll give you an hour of time on the phone or something like this. So there's also a big part of our Oasis programming that will now focus around digital literacy and closing that digital gap. Not only because of our blockchain model, but also because in general, as there's an increase in digital service delivery, we have to ensure that that gender gap is closed, otherwise it'll only widen. I talk really fast.
But you were fascinating, so it's fine. Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions, comments, or stories you want to share about how you're using January Cash in your own work. So, over to you. Please.
Thank you, very fascinating contributions. I would like to know, UN Women obviously has done a lot of accompanying research around this initiative. It would be really interesting to look at, in particular, the girl child's component of this, because obviously, as you just highlighted, there are still power imbalances, and even if you're trying to mitigate against that by, enhancing digital literacy, which I think is absolutely substantial and essential for the future of cash in general, but also in terms of accessing information. I could imagine that husbands and other male household heads find out that women are going to the Oasis Center and benefiting from other things because information flows, right? So has there been any kind of indication that women and girls in particular participating in this have had detrimental effects or negative kind of outcomes because they were going there, or they were prevented from actually attending the centers, just because there was the indication that cash outs would happen this way in the beginning? Thank you.
Great question.
Do you want to take multiple or something?
Right now, Anna, it's all on
sure.
you.
Yes, so when the camps first opened, women and girls were kept inside the caravans for safety reasons, protection reasons, and they were not allowed to go anywhere. So when we started the Oases, they were, as I said, like SGBV centers, like safe spaces. And because they were only for women, they were seen as safe spaces. And there was not that kind of issue. It was okay for women to go there. Over time, we changed from this safe space only women's model to what we call the Oasis Center. And it also actually now includes men in different activities. And we do we do sessions with men as well. We have a whole he for she thing. But it was gradual, right? It wasn't kind of like right there at the beginning. It was a gradual shift over time that first the Oasis Center had to become a place that was trusted. And then we slowly brought in men and did sessions for men so that they could also see what was happening in the center. We have also employed some men from within the community because it's important, we find, to have male champions also to understand what's being done in the center. And we also have a lot of different kinds of programming. So we have a daycare, we have after-school programs for children, and that's also a really important area where we bring in kind of like the tolerance and the nonviolence work through the after-school program. I mean, there's such a dearth of services inside the camp that really anything is seen as positive in most cases, just because there's nothing to do. So once there is something to do, people are happy there's something to do. So that hasn't been so much of an issue.
So for me, that showcases just the importance of integrated and embedded gender programming throughout cash, where we use cash as a key component, as an enabler, the isolation part is very dangerous actually, and so the more it is integrated, the more impactful it will be, right? Across.
Thank you. I'm going to put a show of hands, a flurry. We'll take all 3 questions.
Yeah, my question is for Adesso. Very nice summary there, because I'm interested to know concretely how you did integrate that in the program cycle. Was it updating tools? What other things did you do?
Yeah, updating tools. I think at the beginning when we were doing the research tool itself, because we piloted it on a specific cash transfer program in South Somalia, which is very conflict prone. There's a lot of Al-Shabaab insurgents in some of the areas within that region. So sensitizing the staff there, and then working through those structures like the village relief committees, making sure that there's a gender balance there, they're getting equal access to information, those kind of things, which we were doing before, but just making more of a concerted effort. But yeah, mostly the updating of tools.
So it sounded like tool plus your standard operating procedures that you use.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Your choice.
Thank you. It's a really interesting presentations and discussions. I've been working on agenda and cash, but from a development perspective for over 10 years, and it's really interesting to hear what you're saying around the challenges, because they are very similar. Of course, context is specific and changes, but from the kind of challenges of staff capacity and around knowledge, so kind of very practical sort of issues institutionally, to this sort of process of changing the narrative around integrating gender in terms of thinking about women's leaderships and opportunities for women beyond just being recipients of cash transfers. But so it's really interesting to just hear and sort of reflect on those. But I just had a question about finding out a bit more information really about some of the processes or challenges that you overcome in terms of promoting women's leadership through these types of programs, towards having this kind of integrated package that you were talking about in Jordan. So sort of institutionally and politically, what are the kind of challenges that you faced and then had to overcome to be able to integrate those into your programming?
That could be a question for anybody, so who would like to start?
Maybe
Go
I guess most of the kind of responses that ActionAid would do are actually in contexts where they already have a presence. So in that respect, some of the systems and some of the mechanisms that are already set up. So for example, we have ongoing resilience programming in Somaliland. So in that context, we're already doing exposure in terms of the DRR activities, in terms of development activities, or programming. So then it's less of a challenge. But in the newer context, where if we're moving to newer locations, then it is a bit more challenging. So you do have to kind of take it step by step, ensure that you do the right kind of community mobilization, and understand that it is a slower kind of process in those newer contexts.
Just to add to that, I think in our context, just making sure that you have the right staff in place, making sure that they're well trained to consider those issues, how they enter the community. Often they're from those communities, and looking at the risks like the issue of conflict, those insurgent groups in certain areas. And the way that you talk with the community, so that there's transparency of the type of information that you're giving, so it's not only men or the elders having access to information on the resources, on what the project objective is, etc.
I think from our perspective, it has to be a sustained kind of locally owned model. So the Oasis model is entirely run by the refugees for the refugees. Every single job within the Oasis is a cash for work job done by a Syrian refugee. So in the beginning, it was, there were attitudes and mindsets within the camp community that, jobs aren't for women, jobs are for men. So it took some sustained effort within the community by community leaders to overcome that. And now we're at the point where it's totally, there's no problem at all for women to take cash for work jobs. Now the next challenge that we're seeing is that, jobs outside of the camp with work permits are for men, not for women. So now it's slowly working with families, with the factory owners, finding a few role models that can be champions and talking to other women and saying it's not, all of these concerns that the community is expressing aren't the real situation. Here's what it's like to have a work permit for work. So it has to be kind of a locally owned and a slow, sustained process. You can't expect results overnight. You have to stick with it and you have to make sure that your donors know that the first year maybe isn't going to be when you're going to be seeing the results. It's going to be the year after maybe, or So I think what we're seeing now is, in the camps, these oases are, moving along steadily, but we're now in the process of setting up 5 more in the non-camp settings, and that's now where we're seeing that, where before we had a captive audience in a sense because it's difficult for most people to get permits to leave the camp. So they're in the camp, they've got nothing to do all day in many cases, so they're very happy for services, for opportunities, for things to do. But outside of the camps, there's much more of a daily survival struggle in terms of finding money for food, rent, children's needs. And so there has to be a different entry point to making it clear what the services are that are being offered and why they're relevant and how they can support the community. Thank you.
Really have a question. I do. It's a little bit, it's sort of similar to Rebecca's, but we kind of both come from the perspective of looking at the integration of gender into social protection, essentially, so more long-term development contexts. And just listening to these presentations and the ones before, there's clearly some really big kind of fundamental blockages to the integration of gender in humanitarian programming, let alone in cash-based interventions. And it can be interesting to explore a little bit what some of those more fundamental blockages are, but then looking at humanitarian cash as a relatively speaking, a newer area. There's a lot of, as you said earlier, Karen, the case has been made for doing this. Now it's about doing it well. My question is then, how do we use that as an opportunity almost to kind of get it right in the cash space, and at least also prevent some of the risks that we don't, and that we replicate some of those fundamental blockages in kind of a move to cash-based programming. So it's a big existential question, I'm sure the panel will thank me for, but.
Existential crises.
Yeah, I think that we've had the argument of why not cash, right? Gender, the theme of gender has been around for a while, but I still feel there's a lot of resistance within actors, sometimes at the community level, depending on how you approach the community. So I think just having that push at that level, there's a lot more buy-in now for cash, so I feel like there should be some sort of resurgence for gender in that same aspect, looking at how we can better integrate gender in cash, so that it's not, the main issue for me is just what Tenzin was talking about, the silos, so the cash actors or humanitarian actors working in their own kind of bubble, the gender actors, those kind of issues.
Yeah. Right, add to that, I think it's also a systemic problem as well with the humanitarian system. Cash is a great opportunity because it across all sectors. It can be restricted, conditional, or completely unrestricted. It can be a number of different mechanisms. But what we're working in reality is, still in silos. Most cash is through the multilateral system and through UN agencies that themselves are working in silos. Through no fault of their own in many cases, but I think number one, the kind of coordination at an interagency level is really important. We see the challenges, at kind of global level, but also on the ground when humanitarian responses are starting up. So there's, each agency has a cash advisor, but at the top level, the analysis isn't being necessarily done together, and therefore the responses aren't being designed together, and they're compartmentalized into, cash for food, cash for protection. So I think that, for me, would be a massive achievement if we could overcome that systemic challenge.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you. It's really a persistent problem also in the attitudes and mindsets of humanitarian staff themselves who number one, don't understand how it's relevant, and number two, if they do, they tend to think it's only GBV. They don't understand what gender and humanitarian action really is, other than GBV. And in many cases, the humanitarian coordination forum in a particular setting isn't structured in such a way as to provide an entry point for anything other than GBV.
We have 2 questions. Yes, and then you.
Thank you so much. I work for the European Union's humanitarian department for ECHO, and I just wanted to really echo what you said earlier about this bigger question, because I think that I'm not an expert on gender and cash necessarily, but I think that a lot of challenges I hear today are challenges that we see in general, especially when it comes to the gender analysis of any kind of intervention. We use a gender age marker, for instance, in our work, and we're working on the first assessment report right now, and we see that this is really the biggest challenge, or also where it then often goes wrong, because if you don't do a right gender analysis and your definition of what is an adapted assistance or how you include beneficiaries in the participation becomes very challenging. But I had also a very specific question for you, because you mentioned earlier about the tricky part of, for instance, designing an intervention where there's, for instance, the use of a mobile phone, but then you give the mobile phone to whom, then in the house she doesn't have control over it. And I was just wondering whether you have any specific learning also in that context, and whether you're going to be public about that learning, because I think that's a very practical challenge that I'm sure many people encounter, and I was just wondering about this.
Yeah. So I can speak kind of theoretically and very practically. So I think, theoretically from a bigger picture, any intervention like that has to be partnered with sustained interventions at both like a policy and a normative level. So to work with the community about equality, access issues, and any relevant policy level issues as well. At the practical level, the way that we've dealt with this problem is in the OASIS we have computer labs, and they're not connected to the internet because it's a security consideration. The government doesn't allow internet in the camps. But we are looking at how we can set up kind of like a portal where then the woman would be able to look at her blockchain account and her balance without having access to a mobile phone if she's not able to do that. So we've also tried to find a very practical way. And then also she'll be able to do it at any time by going to the supermarket and getting a readout straight from the supermarket cashier on like a receipt in terms of what her balance is as well. So we try to address it, through 2 ways, by always working on like the community mindsets, but also making sure there's a practical alternative if she doesn't have access to a phone.
Great, thank you. Yes, and then at the back.
Maybe just a comment that in humanitarian sort of architecture structure, we have we use 2 approaches, both the protection and I think gender as well. There is mainstreaming and there is integration. And for example, for protection, integration means different thing than mainstreaming. It's a different approach. So for example, mainstreaming follows certain principles to be integrated into overall protection, let's say, while integration means that we actually have dual objectives. So we have a sectoral objective and protection objective. So I think mainstreaming, and gender mainstreaming for that matter, has been around for a really long time. I think the earliest policies they go back to like early 2000. So I think there could be something to learn from, evaluating or like collecting evidence from how gender was actually mainstreamed in non-cash programs. And I think since 2000, 18 years exactly, 18 years later. So I think there could be some learning to be done there in terms of identifying trends and perhaps factors that block, that create barriers, but also unblock perhaps. Maybe this is already done because, for example, I as a gender marker has been around for a while as well, and this year, this sort of new marker has been launched by IAS, and this is age and gender marker. So, for example, if a partner, NGO partner or UN partner wants to apply for a full fund with OCHA, they have to fulfill certain criteria, right? Good. To be qualified for a gender market.
I'd like to say, in theory, it's
Yes.
supposed to work that way,
Yeah.
but it doesn't.
Well, yes.
Who's vetting the gender marker within the sector?
Exactly.
Who's making the decisions? It's supposed to work like that, but it doesn't.
That's why it's also interesting, like you guys said, that there has to be a gender sort of focal point, of gender capacity within the organization. Is it really the case? I mean, does it have to be like that, or how do we impose policies, and how do we make sure that everybody uses gender marker or gender mainstreaming or whatever approach, even though they may not have a gender capacity inside? I mean, that's kind of a floating question, I guess, but yeah.
Can I answer that one?
Yes.
Yeah. So UN Women does do a lot of sustained policy work on the humanitarian coordination, the gender humanitarian action, and I've been in different humanitarian contexts, and it really depends on like the HC and the senior leadership of the humanitarian country team, and to what extent they insist that it is implemented, because then it does go down, and it does get to the point where, unless you have a good assessment on the gender marker, unless there's actually every single call has a vetting team on the gender marker, and they send back proposals and give organizations a chance to improve it with good recommendations on the gender side, then you see it. But if the senior leadership of the humanitarian country team isn't interested, then they're not going to insist that these policies are implemented, actually.
We have one very patient person at the back. Oh God, no, sorry. No questions. All right, keep them short and sweet, please.
Okay, so there's a question for our colleague at UN Women. So I think we're painfully aware of just how much responsibility falls on a woman's shoulders in any context, and that is compounded in a humanitarian crisis. And therefore, women's got this triple burden that we talked about. So I think, obviously with Cash for Work, it's absolutely critical that we target women so that they're economically empowered, have increased decision making in the community, etc., etc. But what corresponding work or corresponding activities are you rolling out to decrease their workload in their homes and to engage men in those household chores? And I was just wondering whether you were drawing on Oxfam. I don't work with Oxfam anymore, but on Oxfam's tool, the Rapid Care Analysis, which looks at how much time women spend on that care burden, and also kind of solutions to reducing it so that they can more meaningfully participate in Cash for Work programming.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's two components to the answer to that question. So the first is that we actually do have a very robust masculinities component to the Oasis, where we do bring we have trained peer facilitators among men in the camp who then run sessions for men also, and it comes through a psychosocial kind of approach aspect in terms of what does it mean to be a man in the camp when you've identified yourself through your ability to have a wife, have a job, and provide for your family, and none of those are options anymore. How do you then identify, what does it then mean to care for your family, and what is your role within the family? And then again, like a large part of the leadership and civic engagement component within the Oasis is about household dynamics and equality within the home. But of course, a woman's ability, we know, to take on any kind of livelihoods opportunities depends entirely on access to childcare, quality and accessible childcare. So every single Oasis center also has a childcare center, a creche and a nursery and a for and after school age children. So that, and those positions, of course, are all also cash for positions for Syrian refugees that have experience in childcare or teaching from Syria. So, I mean, that's the first enabling factor that's required. So women who are heads of households and don't have anyone else that can support them can access livelihoods to that. But women who do have, for example, a husband at home, they still have the option of taking the child to a center where they'll have the chance to do some, constructive children's activities, etc. But still continuing that conversation with, by men, with men, in the context of the Oasis. Because again, it's not a space only for women. It's a community space that's about kind of enabling factors for short-term resilience and longer-term empowerment.
Rashid, is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
Not in particular. I did just want to make one comment.
Please.
I probably should have made it earlier, but it's interesting that, in the Grand Bargain Workstream meeting, we noticed that gender is, not really present, but also that localization wasn't really articulated as much as it should be. So I just wanted people to think about how, you know, we talk a lot about the UN system, but with, you know, increasing programming going through and in partnership with local organisations, I wanted us just to think about that, especially as we go into the group work, because I think it's important moving forward.
Can I just add one quick thing? Turn to Decca and then come back to you. Decca, do you want to add it?
No.
And then we're back to you, Anna.
So UN Women and this organization called Promundo did something called the Images Study in the Middle East and North Africa, and it looks at masculinities and gender identities. And as of next year in January, we'll roll out that same survey in Jordan, and with a large enough sample size that we'll be able to have also specific findings for refugee communities. Camp and non-camp settings, and that'll be something very interesting in terms of, I think, looking at how do men identify themselves, and you know, what is it to be a man, and also looking, we've seen from the other Middle East, North Africa surveys that actually men want to be more involved in care, but they don't know how to express that. They fear how they'll be perceived, and you know, knowing which men hold which kind of perceptions helps you then in creating techniques and advocacy and campaigns and awareness raising that can address those exact issues.
Images is a great survey. If you haven't read the response, you should. We have a final question at the back.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to that question, that very concrete question you raised about phones within the household, because I think it touches on this question of, and I hope I don't get kicked out of the room for saying this, but what is feasible within short-term humanitarian programs of changing really tough gender dynamics. And this is a question that came up in a course we've been running, and I'm never quite satisfied with the answer I can give to students around, you know, in the context of us having 9 to 12 months, sometimes 24 months, what is realistic for us to try to achieve, and how do we design programs that are sensitive and maybe not accepting status quo where those are not really acceptable, but also realistic about what we're able to change. So I know it's a big question, but I just wonder if these expert panelists have quick insights.
This will be our final question. So final thoughts on what is a very big question.
So at Adesso, 100% of our cash transfer programming is using mobile transfer money. So before we begin the programming, we do an analysis of an assessment just to see the target populations, if they have access to a phone, and what is that access? Do they own a mobile phone? Are they sharing a SIM card? Or do they have their own SIM card but they're sharing a phone? Those kind of, going down to those kind of details. And then, like you said, the reality of it is, if we ask them, are you okay with, if it's a shared SIM card or a shared phone, are you okay with accessing this money? Usually they say yes, but it's our job to make sure that we are monitoring that. So when they receive the cash, is there an issue of control? Are they accessing the right amounts? Is someone else within the household or within the community taking a cut of that? Those kind of things. So I think it goes hand in hand with the assessment and then the monitoring afterwards. So throughout you're trying to see how do they how are they able to still access this aid, but within their context.
Great.
Just very quickly, it's kind of segue to so from my experience, mobile networks are very open to giving SIM cards for free. So even if there is an access issue in terms of, you know, there are quite rare circumstances where women would have absolutely no access to a mobile phone, so that access might be shared. There's also little evidence on if we actually buy a phone, include it in a program, and they can be as cheap as $6 in some contexts, and that's an actual really useful asset. If you do include that in a program, and especially from our urban experience, the findings have been positive that women do get to keep that and use that. So just wanted to say there's like a lot of work you can do with mobile networks. They're very open to giving discounted phones and free SIM cards.
Great.
And I think part of this has to be also an honest conversation with the donor community about what are their indicators and expectations out of 6-month, 12-month humanitarian programming, and having that conversation about integrating it. And from our experience, I mean, Jordan is a perfect example of a country that's on the humanitarian resilience development continuum, because you have vulnerable Jordanians, you have refugees, you have areas in the south that just have, for decades been neglected. So there's a mix of everything. And our approach has been to pool our humanitarian and our development funding so that we can kind of plan it together, design it together, and ensure that we have both kinds of approaches addressing both kinds of issues and building off one another. So.
Fantastic. Everybody, I would like you to thank our panelists. Thank you very much.